All right, the automatic split reduction during the penalty brake application is a temporary and permanent suppression of the train control brake application with the C1 suppression valve. C1 suppression valve in Figure 12, the device in which you use with the P2A brake application valve with the suppression of the reservoir is associated with the cutout cock of the H58 relay air valve with the stop reserve and the temporary suppression valve with the reserve and its adjustment. In junction with the basic 26L brake equipment, the function to provide with a split reduction during the penalty brake application of the freight service. It also provides a temporary permanent suppression over the train control brake applications in both freight and passenger service. The cutout cock is in conjunction with the first suppression reserve in the plug type that has been Ashkelon plated designated with the two-handle position, namely the freight open and the pace passenger closed. The cutout cock handle in the freight position, the first suppression reserve of the cut and provided with a split reduction, then the handle of the passing position reserve the volume in the cutout with the resulting in the straightaway of the reduction during the penalty brake application. The first suppression reservoir contains a volume of air brake pressure whenever the equipment is contained with the freight with the service depending of which predetermined period of the time and provides the timely day before the starting of the first and secondary stages of the split reduction. The manner of which the C1 suppression valve is associated with the device piped into the basic 26L brake equipment is shown in Plate 13. The C1 suppression valve consists of the suppression valve, the portion, and split reduction valve portion mounted on the common brake brake pipe bracket to which all pipe connections are made and identified. 1. The brake pipe. 2. The suppression valve volume reserve. 3. The switch pipe. 6. The timing valve pipes. 8. The lockover pipe. 15. The equalizing reserve charging pipe. 17. The brake valve exhaust. 23. The first suppression reservoir. 24. The reduction limiting reservoir. 25. The power knockout. 26. The suppression pipe. 41. The suppression gauge pipe. And 42. The stop reserve. Switching this around so we can look at it face up. The suppression valve portion, temporary suppression checking, charging valve, temporary suppression valve checking, the permanent suppression valve, the backflow checking valve, the spillover check valve, and the backflow check valve, and the suppression spool valve. While on the split reduction valve portion, you have the differential check valve, the reduction limiting valve, the split volume spool valve, and the split diaphragm valve. Now back to the chat. The suppression valve portion contains the charging valve with the function in the same manner that it does an A1 and A2 reduction selector valve to permit the charging of the first suppression reservoir so long as the associated cutout cock is positioned for the freight service and the automatic brake valve handle in the release position. The charging of the valve also functions as exhaust air of the first suppression reservoir during the brake valve initiated with the brake application to ensure if a penalty application is initiated on the top of the manual brake application, split reduction feature will be nullified. The suppression valve portion also contains the temporary suppression valve, which permits temporary suppression of the train control application in response to the making the light brake of the application of the brake valve, the permanent suppression valve in which the permanent brake suppression of the train control brake application with the brake valve handle has been moved to the suppression position. The split reduction valve portion, the same as was employed with the A1 and the A2 reduction selector valves described in the previous section of this pamphlet, is functions during the penalty brake application to first terminate the charging of the first suppression reservoir, and then this employs the volume of the air, thus equalizing the reservoir reduction into the two distant stages. The first of which is the result of approximately 7 to 8 psi reduction before the starting of the second stage, which the reduction will continue at the service rate until the brake valve handle is moved to the suppression position. The operation, release, and charging. Within the 26C brake valve handling the release position, the handle of the cutout cock in the pipeline of the first suppression reservoir set into the freight position, and the main reserve air flows in the form of port number 3 into the brake valve into port number 3 into the C1 suppression valve in the chamber beneath. The charging of the valve spool valve. The position in this valve uppermost position is shown in Figure 12. Brake pipe air flows to port number 11, brake pipe air flows to port number 1 in the C1 suppression valve pipe bracket from where it flows in the connection made with the charging valve of the spool valve to port number 22. The split reduction spool valve spring tension holds its reduction spool into the lowermost position, connecting the number ports number 22 and 23, thereby permitting the charging of the first suppression reservoir to make the brake pipe pressure. The brake pipe air port of the number 1 also flows in the spring chamber beneath the temporary suppression valve diaphragm to spill over check valve of the suppression spool valve of the brake pipe. The air shows the flow of the charging valve past the charging check valve to the chamber above the temporary suppression valve diaphragm. The temporary suppression valve of the check air valve and also through the port number Port number 2, the temporary suppression volume reserve, charging it approximately to the brake pipe pressure. The brake pipe pressure actuating on both sides of the temporary suppression of the valve diaphragm spring tensions hold the valve and the stem in the uppermost position. Port number 15 is then being connected to the equalizing reserve charging pipe from the 26E braking valve and the P2A brake application valve is charged to the equalizing reserve pressure, and the port number 26 being connected to port number 26 and 26C brake valve and the B2A brake application valve is exhausted with the atmospheric of the brake valve suppression valve with the reducing, limiting in the suppression spool valve area, therefore held into the release position by the spring tension. Port number 24 and 25 are connected with the ports number 24 and 25 respectively at the P2A brake application valve with no penalty brake application in effect and or vented with any pressure. They are split reduction spool valve with the permanent suppression valve that are therefore held into the release position by the spring tension as shown. Port number 6 is connected to port number 5 on the train control timing valve and is vented with the timing valve in the absence of the train control brake application. Port number 42, which is connected with the stop reserve, being connected to port number 6 by the permanent suppression valve with the spool is likewise vented. Port number 8 being connected to port number 8 at the 26C brake valve. The P2A brake application valve is vented with the brake valve suppression at the valve with the brake valve handle in the release position. Port number 17 is connected with the brake valve service exhaust port. Port C at the relay valve of the 26C brake valve. The brake valve handle in the release position and the portion is vented. Port number 41 is connected with the suppression gauge. The pipe is vented with the atmosphere through the temporary suppression of the valve stem. The penalty brake application actuating with the P2A1 brake application valve being reason for the train control is controlled by the actuating train control timing temp valve with the track signaling to permanent number 10 pipe of the air to flow with the brake pipe air brake application valve to port number 6 of the C1 suppression valve with the timing valve. Upon the application of the P2A brake valve application, air to the port number 25 flows to the port number 25 in the C1 suppression valve with the underside of the split reduction spool and lower face to the spring side of the diaphragm permanent suppression valve. Split reduction valve is moved upwardly against the spring tension where charging of the first suppression reservoir and terminated with the reserve volume and is connected with the Viva port number 31 in the chamber beneath the split reduction diaphragm valve. The split reduction diaphragm valve is a spool valve that's held in the uppermost position approximately 20 seconds duration, which is timely required for the volume air to the vent from the calibrated choke into the cover. When the split reduction diaphragm of the valve in uppermost into port number 24 and into port 24B, the connection is cut off. The permanent suppression valve is held in the uppermost position to permit air from the port number 6 to number 10 pipe of the air for the P2A brake air application valve to flow through the port number 42. The stop reserve also passes the backflow check valve in through the port number 8 into the exhaust suppression valve at port 26C brake valve. Equalizing reserve air flows into the port number 24 C1 suppression valve. Equalizing combined with the number 24 pipe volume, reducing and limiting the reserve between the P2A brake application valve and the split reduction diaphragm valve to provide the first stage of the split reduction number 24 pipe between the two valve devices must be a specific length dependent upon the pipe size. The so provide a volume that will produce an initial equalizing reserve reduction to of approximately 7 to 8 psi after the pressure of the first suppression reserve has been reduced the predetermined amount by the venting and the choking of the cover. The spring tension will move in the split reduction diaphragm valve downwardly to reestablish the port number 24 to 24B connection. Then the equalizing reservoir pressure reduction will continue the venting of the atmosphere V with the port 24B past the reduction limiting valve. The reduction, which in this second stage of the split reduction will continue at service rated until the brake valve handle is moved to the suppression position. A minimum reduction. The first part of the split reduction follows the penalty braking application cannot be avoided. However, the full service brake application may be avoided by moving the automatic brake valve handle to the suppression position in time to reset the P2A brake application valve. Before the expiration of approximately 20 seconds after the initiating of the penalty brake application, this 20-second is approximately delay time before the start of the second stage of the split reduction movement of the brake valve at the handle suppression position permits the air to the main reserve pressure to flow from the port number 26 at the brake valve through port number 26 at the C1 suppression valve, causing the reduction limiting the valve to be moved against the spring tension in its uppermost position, closing off the exhaust equalizing reserve air from the port number 24B. Also with the brake valve handle in the suppression position, the air is exhausting from port number 3 and allowing the charging of the valve to be moved downwardly by the spring tension. This closes the brake pipe port of the number 1 to charging valve of the exhaust port number 22 through the atmosphere through the choke located in the suppression valve cover. If the P2A brake application is reset with the delay time, the reduction spool will reestablish the port number 23 and the 22 connection. As a result of venting air from the port number 25, the underside of the spool valve via the slide with the V of the brake application valve there. The first suppression reservoir is then exhausted. Part of it passed up the upper end of the charge valve through the exhaust choke of the suppression valve with the cover. The equalizing reserve air port of the 24 is exhausted at the brake application valve, the slide valve. Port number 5, the equalizing reservoir, bottle up the release control valve within the brake application immediately following the resetting of the P2A brake application movement of the brake valve handle to release the position, actuating the release control of the valve to reestablish the port number 15 to port number 5 connection with the brake application, permitting the running and the release of the brakes. If the P2A brake application does not reset within the delay time period, the entire supply of the first suppression reservoir will be exhausted for the time of the choking covering beneath the split reduction diaphragm valve. This valve will then be moved downwardly in spring tension to reestablish the port number 24 to port number 24B connection. Since the brake valve handle was placed in suppression position, equalizing reservoir air cannot be vented. Atmosphere pass to the upper end of the reduction limiting valve to port number 24B. However, the equalizing reservoir air can flow from port number 24B past the light spring-loaded differential check valve, initiating into the equalizing reservoir charging port number 15. Since the pressure in that line is reduced approximately 24 psi when the brake valve handle was moved in suppression position, result in the full surface brake application assured during the penalty application. Brake application. Should it become necessary for an over reduction, can be made by the following: split off reduction, move the automatic brake valve handle further towards the handle off position with the equalizing reservoir charging port number 15 exhausted at the brakes of the valve beyond the full surface reduction to the zero handle off position. So as long as the P2A brake valve that has not been reset, the equalizing reservoir air port in number 5, the brake application valve will flow from the ports number 24 and 24B and C in the C1 suppression valve. Pass the differential check in the equalizing reservoir charging port of the number 15, then to brake the valve exhaust. If, however, the P2A brake application valve has been reset, this function will be nullified by the C1 suppression valve that will be taken over by the over reduction check valve located in the P2A brake application valve. If the penalty brake application is initiated on the top of the brake valve service brake application, therefore no split reduction because the port number 3 has been exhausted. If the brake valve permits the exhausting of the air for suppression reserve past the charging of the valve of the C1 suppression valve, equalizing reserve air will exhaust to the atmosphere, passing the reduction to limiting VIVA the ports number 24 and 24B. Temporary suppression of the train control brake penalty brake application. To obtain temporary suppression of the train control penalty brake application, a light manual brake valve of the brake application should be made. And air to port number 3 in the chamber beneath the charging of the valve, and the C1 suppression valve is exhausted. Charging the valve is moved downwardly in spring tension to permit the venting of the air from the first suppression reservoir through the choke of the suppression valve cover, brake pipe pressure, reducing the spring chamber beneath the temporary suppression valve, and then thus the pressure differential caused by the high temperature temporary suppression reserve pressure acting on the diaphragm causes the temporary suppression valve assembly to move downwardly and move with it where its stem contacts unseated with the temporary suppression check valve. Air from the chamber above the temporary suppression diaphragm and the temporary suppression volume reserve then flows from the unseated check valve to the number 4 valve to around the suppression spool valve through the port number 41, the chamber above the permanent suppression spool valve and the suppression gauge. This air at the same time with exhausting slowly through the choke and the cover of the suppression valve of the atmosphere, and air pressure develops in the chamber above the permanent suppression of the VIVA, the diaphragm, the valve assembly is moved downwardly against the spring tension, cutting off the flow of the air from the number 10 pipe of the P2A brake application valve through the train control, timing through the number 6 end port and the C1 suppression valve to the stop reserve number 4, port number 42 lock over pipe. Port number 8 actuating of the P2A brake application valve is thus temporarily suppressed. As the pressure of the air chambered above the temporary suppression valve of the diaphragm, the temporary suppression valve reserve reduced to being vented through the cover of the choke of the balance of the pressure is reached across the temporary suppression valve diaphragm after each of the spring tension will move temporary suppression valve assembly upwardly drawingly into the piston stem of the contact with the check valve to allow with the seated with the terminating the further inflow of the temporary suppression reservoir air to the atmosphere. However, the air of the port number 41 in the chamber above the permanent suppression valve of the diaphragm assembly will continue to vent through the cover of the choke until the depletion of the air pressure in the chamber above the diaphragm suppression valve of the diaphragm will permit the spring to return diaphragm assembly to the uppermost position, reestablish the connection from the port number 6 to ports number 42 and 8. Therefore, successfully manual brake applications required. Each application may additional brake pipe reductions. Thus, each time the brake application is increased. All right, pipe 17 from the C1 suppression valve is connected to the port X at the brake of the relay valve of the exhaust cavity. On the long freight trains, the large volume of the brake pipe air is exhausted into the cavity in the brake valve. This air flows into the port number 17 of the C1 suppression valve. Whenever the light manual brake applications are made, whenever the brake valve handle is placed in suppression position, the air flows from port number 17 through the backflow of the check valve to and around the suppression spool valve, port number 41, the chamber above the permanent suppression valve of the diaphragm. This addition of air to serve and hold the permanent suppression valve to cut off the port number 6 and port number 42 for an additional length of time. This air will eventually exhaust from the choke of the suppression valve that covers as well as the choke at the brake of the valve relay brake pipe exhaust cavity. The temporary suppression will be in the effective area effort for a limited time until the brake valve handle is moved to the suppression position. Permanent suppression. To obtain permanent suppression of the train control brake application, automatic brake valve handle should be moved to the suppression position. Port number 8 is blank for the brake valve, and the main reserve air supplies in port number 26. The air flow through the port number 26 to the C1 suppression valve flows to the chamber of the upper face of the suppression spool valve, forcing the spool valve downward into its lowermost position at the spring tension. In this position, the suppression spool valve cuts off flows in temporary suppression volume reserved at the chamber above the permanent suppression valve diaphragm, but instead connects the brake pipe air from port number 1 to port number 41, and in its chamber brake pipe air are utilized to hold the permanent suppression valve assembly lowermost position to cut off the port number 6 to port number 42 and 8 connection to provide permanent suppression. Operating instructions.